Hello again. So, mere hours after recording the video about the plans in the Maroczy Bind of the accelerated dragon variation, lo and behold, somebody played this against me in an online game, and I thought it was worth showing the game as it reveals a lot of the concepts that we talked about. So let's look at the game. Okay, so in this game I played as white. My opponent was rated approximately 2350, and we played a Sicilian where we ended up in the accelerated dragon, and I played the Maroczy Bind. I played knight f6, knight c3, pawn d6. Here, if I am careless and I play bishop e3, this is where they can play knight g4, and this is quite annoying because they're attacking my bishop. So to make sure that doesn't happen, start with bishop e2. They take. Remember, one of black's ideas is that they're trying to trade some minor pieces because they have less space than white has. Take back with the queen, bishop develops, castle, castle. Now they're threatening a discovered attack on my queen, where they move the knight somewhere and then will attack my queen. So now I have to move my queen. In this variation, the queen usually will drop back to d3 instead of to d2. There are some other variations where instead of castling, white starts by developing their bishop, and in that case, the queen could drop back to d2. But in this position, we wouldn't want to play our queen to d2 because it would block our bishop in. So queen to d3. A nice thing about this setup is that the queen on d3 helps fight against the b5 pawn break by controlling that square. They played their bishop to e6, something we didn't talk about in the other video. But when the bishop's on e6, one thought that can sometimes happen is you start thinking, okay, maybe I play f4 and then f5, attack the bishop, start getting some sort of attack going. It's not something that white is going to do anytime soon, but it's something that's in the back of one's mind and when they develop this way. So continue developing bishop e3. They play rook c8. They're now attacking my c4 pawn, so I'm more or less forced to play b3. b3 is a move I wanted to play anyway. We said that that was one of the key ways to fight, in particular against the a5 to a4 plan, but it's a good idea to solidify the center against this sort of setup anyway. They played pawn to a6. This lets us know that they're most likely planning to play for the b5 break. So at the moment, we have the b5 square really well under control. We have 4 pieces all fighting for it. They're only defending it once, so it's really not an immediate threat. Played rook c1, they played rook e8. I don't think this is really the best move. Probably they should start with something that helps to support the b5 push, maybe queen a5. However, even then, they're still not really threatening to play pawn to b5 because of how much support I have over that. So I played h3, and this was the more modern approach that we talked about in the other video. They played knight d7. And at this point, this is a rapid game, so we only had about 10 minutes total for the game, each of us. And I started hallucinating a little bit, thinking that b5 was a threat at the moment because of the potential attacks on my knight. These are not actually attacks because I'm defending it with the queen and the rook as well, since I have 2 defenders of the knight. But I started worrying, okay, maybe if the knight comes to e5, it gets a tempo on the queen, so maybe there's some sequence where this could be a problem. And I just threw my knight onto d5. This was perhaps a little bit rushed. Like I mentioned in the other video, we don't really want to rush to throw our knight onto d5, as we want to kind of keep our options open for potentially recapturing with either of the pawns. So they captured, and now they brought their queen out to a5. And this was probably the one moment in the game where I started to worry a little bit, because I thought, okay, they're attacking my a2 pawn, and maybe their queen is going to be kind of annoying. The one natural way that I could defend my pawn would be to move my rook to a1, except that that doesn't work because the bishop is covering that square. I thought about playing a4. White would be okay if this happened, still maybe slightly better, but they maybe queen to b4. I play rook b1. They might play their knight to c5, attack my queen. I move my queen. And in this kind of position, we can see how important it is that white has not traded the dark colored bishops for each other, because I am going to be able to evict this knight from c5 at some point. If we didn't have the dark colored bishops, it would be quite difficult. This would be sort of the dream position that black is aiming for. With the dark colored bishops, I'll eventually be able to play something like bishop d2, pawn to b4 and get rid of that knight. Might take a little bit of time to prepare all this because I need to make sure I don't lose all these different pawns that are here. So in this position, after queen a5, I drop my queen back to d2 as a way to defend the pawn. I wasn't certain about this, but I thought, okay, the ending should definitely be good. Keep in mind, I have a bishop pair. I didn't really give up anything in return at this point. So they traded, and then they made a bad move. They played pawn to e6, and this is what I mean about them lashing out at some point. And again, remember, this is a strong player that I'm playing. This is not somebody that doesn't know what they're doing. They're 2300 plus rated. And so if you consider to go back to this position, what is black trying to do? Like, they could try to play b5, but I have that square very well covered with my pawn and my bishop. They could pivot to maybe switch to a plan involving a5, but even once they do that, they'll play a5, then I could play a3, then they could, I guess, bring their knight there, but I'll kick it away. Now, in this specific position, this plan doesn't really work well for me because they would come in with a fork. But in the long run, all I have to do to prepare this is actually have retreated my bishop first. So they could try to go for this sort of plan, but it's not going to really succeed. Because, okay, we'll do a3, then the knight goes there. Maybe we need to tweak the move order a little bit, move our bishop there first. b4 is coming next. They're not going to be able to stop this in the long run because they don't really have any play of their own. So this is what causes them to make a move like e6, trying for some activity. So take, and now let's take stock of this position a little bit. So at the moment, black has two big weaknesses on the d6 pawn and the e6 pawn circled in red. Those are not isolated, they can support each other, but they're pretty clear targets for white. White will plan to, for example, move their rooks to the middle of the board from where they pressure those. White also has the bishop pair. The bishops are very open right now. This is not a closed position after they played pawn to e6. If we go back a move, at this point we could say maybe that this bishop is a little bit of a potential problem for white, but by playing e6, really opens things up for the bishop because now the bishop gets this really beautiful diagonal that it can go to. So I played bishop f3. It's not only threatening the pawn, it's also just threatening to move to the b7 square from where it will fork the rook and the pawn. So this is starting to get a little difficult for black to deal with. So they move the rook to defend. I centralize my rook. They move their knight to e5. I retreated my bishop to e2. It would have been better to just move it to e4. There was no real reason to go all the way back here. Nothing was spoiled or anything, but there's not any benefit of going to e2 over c4. I was mostly thinking, again, about preventing the b5 break, but apparently here it's not really working very well because from e4, if they were to go for the b5 break, it's not great in this situation because they're essentially just opening the position up more for my bishops anyway, so it wasn't something I needed to worry too much about. In any case, they retreated their knight back to f7, bishop b4, putting some pressure on the d6 pawn. They defended the pawn. My bishop comes out here where it attacks this other pawn on g4. And this is an example of where I said the advantage of having pushed our pawn to h3 instead of to f3 early on, because the bishop is able to get out to this square, whereas if the pawn had been on f3, it would have been blocked in. Now, what does black do to defend this pawn? Actually, it's very difficult to come up with a good suggestion because if they were to defend it with the rook, the problem would be this pawn on d6. I would just take it. If they defended it with the knight, then I would just attack the knight, make the knight move, and then take the pawn next. So the natural move is to move the pawn up to e5, but this is causing big problems in the long run because now this bishop is wide open. The d5 square is very weak. I can put either a bishop or a rook on that square, and it's going to be difficult to attack. And also, they blocked in their own bishop with this pawn move. So this has a short-term advantage of avoiding dropping the pawn, but in the long run, this is a big concession that black is making. So I move my bishop to e6 to try to take advantage of this. They moved their bishop to f8. I wasn't really sure what they were trying to do. The plan of what their goal is revealed in a couple of moves. I played a4 just to make sure that I really shut down the idea of b5 permanently. I don't want that to ever happen. They come up with their king. Now I see that's why they played their bishop to f8. They're trying to activate their king. Move my bishop to d5. This is a really good square for the bishop. It's going to take the knight at least 4 moves to somehow get to attack it, even if this pawn weren't there. Like, we could imagine a sequence like this to get there, but it's going to take a very long time. And even once that happens, I'll just recapture with the rook. They come up with their king. Notice how tied down all the black's pieces are. And it might take a little bit of time to break through, but we can play a move like rook to d3, and this is getting very active. If we get our rook to f3 with check, that's going to be a big problem. In fact, right now we're threatening to win the f7 knight. So they played knight g5. Computer does not like knight g5 at all, but it's not that easy to come up with particularly good moves for black either. So play h4, make the knight move. Knight goes back to e6, and here everything kind of tentatively is glued together where it's holding a little bit. I can play rook f3, which is what I did. Forces the king, which is defending the knight, to move. The king can move to a square where it's still defending the knight, but it's still very tenuous. Here I made a move that the computer did not like. It still says white is better, but I had an even stronger move. So I played the move g3. My idea was to restrict black's knight from ever hopping into f4. The computer says that actually I can just play c5 here and win the game immediately. I did not see this line, or I looked at c5, but I didn't see the exact continuation. I thought, okay, they take, and then I take back, and now my bishop is hanging, so it's check. They have to deal with it, but we'd have something like this, and I wasn't really clear why I would go for this kind of continuation where it feels like maybe my pieces are a little bit precarious because my rook is aligned with their bishop, and my rook is also the only piece protecting my own bishop. However, I have an amazing move here that I did not see, which is rook takes c5. And now the only move that really makes any sense for them is to capture my rook. I capture here, and just look at these bishops. They are really amazing. They're controlling every single square on this row. It's check. And so actually black is just totally busted here. They move their king here. I come in with my rook, check. They move the king to c8. I come in with the bishop, and actually the only legal move they have now is to interpose with the rook, but this position is completely lost now. They're literally just losing all their pieces. Take, and then they're going to lose their rook afterwards as well, and so this game is just completely over. So I didn't see that. Instead I made the preparatory move g3, and they played b5. Again, an example of them lashing out. It's very hard to be patient when you're seeing that your opponent is making useful moves that are improving the position. Like, let's remember that in the last couple of moves, I've activated my rook to f3. I've gotten my bishop to d5. It looks like I'm making some progress, even though it's kind of slow. I have another idea in this position that maybe I move my king up, bring my rook over to h1, move this pawn. These ideas are a little bit far-fetched in some sense because they take several moves. But if black's not doing anything, I will execute those plans. So that's what causes them to make a lashing out move like b5. Problem with b5, one problem anyway, is they take back, and I play a5, and now I have a really, really strong passed a pawn. Now, bishops work really well with passed pawns because they just control the squares that are fighting for, or control the squares that the pawn is needing to get access to. Also, problem, they've opened up the c file for my rook, and so we were talking about how maybe what my plan would be to get the rook involved was this sort of ludicrous plan of king g2, pawn h5, rook h1, and then invade on the 7th rank. Well, they just made my life a lot easier. So they played rook c8 to fight for the file. I doubled, they exchanged, they played knight d4. Sort of was expecting this move, wasn't really sure what else they would do. They played rook c7 check, they came in here, we trade rooks, and now we have a situation that it's even material, but this passed a pawn is really, really good. It's very hard to stop the a pawn. Actually, it's really impossible to stop it without giving up a piece. I pushed the pawn, they moved their knight to c6, and here I don't want to capture. Capturing would be a big mistake because the king is within the square of the pawn, so the king can still stop this pawn. Still, this position would be okay for white, but they're in danger of losing the a pawn, and then they'd be down a pawn. Black would start to get some play of their own with this pawn marching forward. Now here I made a kind of cool move. I played bishop to a5, and this move initially might look like it's hanging a bishop, but they can't take because now the pawn will be unstoppable. And the problem they have is that I'm about to play my bishop to b6. From there, I'm going to push my pawn to a7, and then I'm going to push my pawn to a8, and they can't really do anything about that. And so this position is just lost for black. They played their knight to a7, bishop went to b6 anyway to attack the knight. They played knight c8, dropped my bishop back, and this is a good example of how bishops will help support passed pawns, because the bishops each control the opposite complex of color squares. So one bishop controls a7, the other one controls a8, and the pawn is just unstoppable. They played king c7, pawn a7. Only thing they can do to stop me from getting a queen is take. They come back. We played a couple more moves, but there's not really much left to play for here. Something to notice in this position also, I think what their idea of this setup is that they were hoping to maybe attack my bishop, and let's say that they attacked my bishop and then I retreated my bishop back here. We take. Maybe somehow in the time that it takes for me to get all these pawns, they can somehow start to generate counterplay. I don't really believe in that plan because I can almost certainly move my pawn to b4 and shut that all down. But maybe because the pawns are on dark squares, they can buy some time. But the bishops actually just completely stop this plan completely, because the two bishops actually in a sense protect each other, because this bishop controls these two squares and this bishop controls the other square. So my opponent resigned in this position. So I thought that this game was a good addendum to the previous video where we looked at some of the strategies of the Maroczy Bind setup. Here we saw some of them in action. I don't claim this was a perfect Grandmaster level game or anything, but I think it was reasonably well played. I'm pretty happy with most of my moves in it. The queen trade that I made early on was probably not the greatest decision. I could have pressed a little bit more than that. However, it got me to an ending where I really was playing for two results, in the sense that I had bishop pair, I had both my bishops were good, I had mobility with my pawns. That's very important when you have a bishop pair, that you want to be able to make sure that the pawns are fluid, that they can move. So it was a good position that I was trading into. Okay, thank you for watching this, and see you next time.